Hey guys, today is day 2 of our unit on the executive branch. And so today you guys are going to be doing an ed puzzle on presidential campaigns and presidential elections. Okay. So your learning objectives for day 2 are that you can explain the election process for the United States presidency and that you can apply the knowledge that you're going to learn from doing this ed puzzle today, the knowledge you're going to learn on the Electoral College to make predictions in upcoming elections. This year's an election year, we've talked about it, and you're going to be making predictions in our after lecture activity for the 2020 election. All right. So, for the election process, you guys started with an activity today on campaigning. You looked at a campaign video from Reagan's run for re-election in 1984. And so campaigning has been a part of the presidential election process since the very beginning of the office. People run to be president and they spend lots of money on election campaigns to get voted into office. But today we're really going to be focusing on what happens after and how candidates get elected president in the United States. They campaign, but then there's an actual election process they need to go through. And so we're going to return to our case study on Ronald Reagan and look at the 2 terms that he was elected, 1980 and 1984. Okay, so democracy in action. We have a democratic style of government in the United States, and being allowed to elect a president is a huge part of our government and the way it is. So after candidates campaign to become president and our 2 parties pick a nomination, all registered voters in the United States will have the opportunity to vote for president. The presidential election is held on Election Day, which is just Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And the president doesn't win alone on the popular vote. When the registered voters go to the polls and they cast their vote, all those votes are tallied and they become the popular vote. But presidential candidates cannot win on the popular vote alone. They have to win the Electoral College, which is really what we're going to be focusing on today. In the 2016 election, if you look at my picture on the right, Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote by about 2 million votes. But as you know, Donald Trump ends up becoming our president, and that's due to the Electoral College. Okay, so going back to our case study on Reagan, taking a look at the popular vote from 1980, Reagan won by a very small margin, just 50.7%. But since Jimmy Carter's side, who was the Democratic nomination running against him, he really won big because Jimmy Carter only got 41% of the votes, and then there were some other third-party candidates that took up part of that percentage. Okay, so moving on into the Electoral College. All right, so what is the Electoral College? It's the process by which the president is formally elected in the United States. We have our popular vote, but to be formally elected, they have to go through the Electoral College and win. So the popular vote, that those numbers go to the electors for the state, and then the electors in each state will vote to elect a president. The electors will collect the popular vote, and then they will cast their own votes in the Electoral College. Okay, who gets to serve in the Electoral College? The members of the college come from all kinds of places. They're state officials, state party leaders, people in the state who have personal or political affiliations with the party's presidential candidate. They come from all throughout the government and the population. Each state has the same number of electors as they have representatives in Congress. And remember, Congress is the House of Representatives and the Senate put together. Okay? So each state gets the same number as they have in Congress. So we have a total of 538 electors. 535 of those come from Congress, and an additional 3 are electors from the District of Columbia. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Okay. When does the Electoral College vote? Okay. We, in the population of the United States, we cast our vote in November. The Electoral College actually votes on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. They vote a month after the popular vote comes in. So electors from each state are expected to choose the candidates that won the popular vote. For the most part, if they win the popular vote in that state, the state and all the electors in it are going to vote in that direction in the Electoral College. Some states even have laws requiring that they vote in the same direction. But some states, however, do not stop their electors from voting against the popular vote of the state. And that's how we end up with situations like what happened in 2016. So, the electoral ballots are signed, sealed, and sent to the President of the Senate on that Wednesday in December after they cast their vote. And the President and Vice President are formally elected on January 6th, when the President of the Senate opens and reads the electoral votes in front of Congress. Okay. There's 2 amendments that deals with the Electoral College that you need to be familiar with. The first one's the 12th Amendment, which was ratified in 1804. Prior to the 12th Amendment, the President and the Vice ran separately, and they were voted into office separately. What was essentially happening is the number 1 finisher would become president, and the runner-up would become vice president. 2 people that were running against each other would now have to work together for 4 years in office. So the 12th Amendment changed that to where the president and the VP start running together as a team, coming from the same political party. And now the electors in the Electoral College would cast 1 vote instead of 2. Just 1 for the vice and the VP, and not 2 separate for each office. And the 12th Amendment also established that if no one candidate received at least 26 votes, then the decision would go to the Senate. Okay? Then a little bit later on down the road, we got the 23rd Amendment, which was ratified in 1961. This dealt with the District of Columbia. District of Columbia is a federal territory. That's where Washington, D.C. is located. Since it's not a state, the people who live there have no local government and could not vote in federal elections. But since they felt like they should be able to vote for the president, since they're still full citizens and have to obey laws and things like that. So this amendment gave the citizens of D.C. the right to vote in presidential elections and 3 electoral college votes. So now the people living in Washington, D.C., even though they're not living in a state, can vote in presidential elections, and they have representation in the Electoral College. Okay, so looking back at Reagan's elections, this was the Electoral College map in 1980. Now remember the popular vote that we just looked at. A lot more states in the Electoral College voted in favor of Ronald Reagan than the popular vote. A lot more voted for him than the popular vote. Even though he won on both, we see in this map some of the states flipping to vote for Ronald Reagan, flipping against the majority. Then, if we look at the 1984 map, we see the same thing happening again. If you look over on the right-hand side, in the popular vote, Reagan won by a pretty good percentage, but he won 58.8% of the popular vote. In the Electoral College, he won 97.6% of the votes. Only 13 electors out of 538 did not vote for Ronald Reagan. So again, we see how the difference between the popular vote and the Electoral College. It's more common for it to be this way. with the person who wins the popular vote also winning the Electoral College. But as we know from what we've looked at in the past, in 2016, it was not that way. Who won the popular vote did not win the Electoral College vote. Okay. Presidential term. So we've talked briefly about presidential terms. They can serve a maximum of 2 full terms, 8 years, 4 years per term. If the president's unable to serve, the vice president, of course, takes their place. Presidential succession is what that scheme is called, when the vice president becomes the president in the event the president dies or is disabled or is impeached. And so the vice president can serve up to 10 years as president, 2 years to finish the term of another that had to leave office, and then 2 full terms themselves. If the president were to die, be disabled, or be impeached less than 2 years into his term, the vice could then only serve 1 full term and the remainder of that president's term. Okay, and so there's 3 amendments that deal with these established guidelines of presidential terms and succession, and we're going to look at those very briefly. Okay, first one's the 20th Amendment. It was ratified in 1933. It determined that the presidential term ends on January 20th at noon. Before that, presidents actually served all the way up until March, but this pushed it back to January 20th, which is also Inauguration Day. When we get a new president, this is the day that they are sworn into office. And this was the first time, the First Amendment, who identified who succeeds the president if he or she dies, which is, of course, the vice president. Then we have the 22nd Amendment. It was ratified in 1951, and it just set limits on presidential terms and said that no one person can serve more than 2 terms as President of the United States. Up until this point, it was just tradition, and as we talked about yesterday, there's only one president who has served more than 2 terms, and that was FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. He served 3 full terms and then just a little bit into his 4th term before he died. And then the last presidential amendment is the 25th Amendment. It was ratified in 1967. It addresses presidential succession again, allowing the VP to become president in the event of the president's death, incapacitation, resignation, and impeachment. It states the president can regain office by sending a declaration to Congress in the event of a temporary step down. Guys, if presidents temporarily got sick, if Trump caught the coronavirus, he could temporarily step down from office. Mike Pence would become president. And if Trump got better and came back to office, he would have to first send a declaration to Congress. And then it also outlines how the president can fill the role of the vice president in the event he or she were to die, resign, or is removed from office. All right, so that's it for our lecture on presidential elections and campaigns. Please reach out if you have any questions. For the remainder of today, you need to be working on your 2020 election predictions posted in Google Classroom under week 12. But I'm here if you have any questions. If not, I will talk to you guys tomorrow.